The following is a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. We hope that you find today's lesson presented by our minister, Dr. Joseph Becker, informative, insightful, and inspirational.
The text for this morning's lesson is a conflation of Matthew 28, 1 through 15, Mark 16, 1 through 11, Luke 24, 1 through 12, and John 20, 1 through 18. Now, whenever I put together one of these intertextual readings, part of the purpose of that is to try to nail down the chronology of the events. As I've told you before, if the four Gospels were identical, word for word, in correspondence with one another, that would be a real problem. Because anytime two witnesses give testimony that is identical, that is cause for suspicion, because it gives the distinct impression of collusion or conspiracy. Indeed, if you look up the word identical in the Moby Thesaurus, some of the synonyms that are suggested are coordinate, fake, counterfeit, phony, ersatz, simulated, and duplicate, all of which raise alarm bells among those who are concerned with the reliability of evidence. So, the fact that the four Gospels differ from one another in presentation, vocabulary, perspective, inclusions, and exclusions remonstrates for the reliability of their testimony. However, while dynamic differences in testimony are good, contradictions in testimony are not so good. And I've seen a number of attempts at chronological reconstructions of the resurrection narratives that juxtapose the Gospels in some very unsatisfactory ways, in some cases actually creating new problems for the text. So bearing those in mind, when I set out to put together my reading for this morning's lesson, I decided to take a completely fresh approach, discarding many of the assumptions with which I had previously examined these passages. And I have to tell you that I'm pretty happy with the result, because the product, which is the text for today's lesson, not only addresses some of the chronological hiccups that have hectored me over the years, but also sheds new light on some aspects of what actually happened on the morning of Sunday, April 5, 33 A.D. The text begins as follows: When the Sabbath had passed, early toward the dawn of the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene, from whom the Lord had cast out 7 demons, Mary the mother of James, Joanna, Salome, and the other women bought spices. And the other women here may include the mother of the sons of Zebedee, Mary of Clopas, Susanna, and a sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now here already we have something interesting, a telling glimpse into Hebrew culture in first century Palestine. Henry Ford invented the 5-day work week. Prior to the 20th century, everyone in the Christian world worked 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, and took Sunday off. And the work week began again bright and early Monday morning. But in the Hebrew world, since the advent of the Mosaic covenant, the 1 day a week that is set aside for rest has always been Saturday, the Sabbath. And for them, the work week began again bright and early Sunday morning, on the first day of the week. That's why the earliest Christians most generally met for their assemblies on Sunday nights rather than Sunday mornings, because the church was born into Hebrew culture, and in that culture everyone rested on Saturday and worked on Sunday. And on Sunday, the workday started early. In Proverbs 31, the queen mother of King Lemuel outlines for him her idea of an ideal woman, the only kind of woman who would be good enough for her son. And in verse 15 of that chapter, she says, she rises while it is still night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. But in order to do this on Sunday morning, on the first day of the week after the Sabbath, she might very well have to go shopping first. After all, there was no refrigeration, and she would not have been to the market for anything fresh in 2 days. And in order to provide for this need, markets in Jewish provinces opened very early on Sunday mornings, while it was still night, perhaps as early as 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning. That's why these women were able to buy and prepare spices for the anointing of the Lord's body before the breaking of dawn. Because not just the butcher, the miller, and the egg seller are open in the third watch of the night, but the spice merchant was open as well. So it isn't as though these women were lurking around stealthily on abandoned streets in the quietest part of the day. No, in Hebrew culture in first century Palestine, 4 a.m. on Sunday morning is rush hour, at least for women. The men may still have been in bed, but every woman in Jerusalem was on the move at that hour. Not only that, but though there were only 3 crucifixions on the preceding Friday, Jesus and the criminals on the cross, they were not the only ones who died on that day. No, statistically speaking, somewhere between 25 and 30 people in that region died every day. So that Sunday morning, no fewer than 50 or 60 families in that area would have been on the hunt for burial spices. So Mary and the others might actually have had to wait in line at the spice merchants that morning to get the supplies that they needed to anoint the Lord. And with this in view, I think that most of the depictions we have seen in movies and in historical reenactments showing these women skulking around in somber silence as a Herman Dew eerily purls over the cobbled alley beds and byways of the city are probably misleading. No, if these women went unnoticed in their goings about, it wasn't on account of stealth, but on account of the anonymity of city life. They may have felt lonely on the streets that day, but it wasn't because they were alone. It was because of the privation that comes with grieving. Continuing on with our text. And when they had prepared them, they brought them to the tomb just as the sun was rising, so that they might anoint him. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When all at once there was a great earthquake. For an angel of the Lord descended from the heavens, and came and rolled back the stone, and sat atop it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow. Now at this point, I just want to pause to call your attention to the order of the events here. There are no human witnesses to the actual resurrection of Christ. He was in the tomb, alone when he rose, and no one on earth saw that happen. However, there are witnesses to the rolling away of the stone. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Joanna, Salome, and the other women. Now, in 1930, a fellow by the name of Albert Henry Ross, writing under the pseudonym Frank Ross, wrote a book entitled Who Moved the Stone?, which book has remained in constant demand ever since, having been reprinted no fewer than 10 times. Now, the question stated in the title is a rhetorical question. Everybody knows who moved the stone. The relevant point of that question for Ross's book, however, was based on the timeline of the resurrection as he had reconstructed it. Because according to Ross's timeline, the tomb was inspected immediately after it was opened and was found to be empty. Thus, Ross concluded that when Jesus rose, his glorified body, being capable of teleportation, he did not need to roll the stone away. Rather, when he exited the tomb, he went through the stone. Or to put it more precisely, he dematerialized in the tomb and rematerialized outside the tomb. Now, that is certainly possible. After all, the biblical record of the Lord's post-resurrection appearances testify that on this first day alone, he made at least 3 appearances, miles apart from one another, appearing out of the thin air on one occasion and vanishing into thin air on 2 others. So we know that his glorified body, though manifestly physical, he was not a ghost, was capable of traversing great distances in a short time and could pass through matter unimpeded. And as such, Ross could be right. Jesus could have left the tomb in his body prior to the stone having been rolled away. But according to the chronology I'm presenting to you this morning, which I invite you to research for yourself, no such teleportation is indicated. The angel descended, rolled the stone away, and took a seat atop the stone. Then, as our text continues, "And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. And seeing that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away from the tomb, and remembering the Lord's words, the women returned, running from the tomb, and told all these things to the 11 apostles, and to all the rest. But these words seemed like an idle tale, and they did not believe them." According to Luke 24, 7 through 11, and John 20, 1 through 2, the women did not inspect the tomb the first time they went there. Rather, seeing that it had been opened, and frightened by the appearance of the angel, they ran immediately to tell the others what they had seen. And in the meantime, Jesus could very well have walked bodily out of the tomb without the aid of teleportation. And I tend to think that that's what happened, because as a rule of thumb, the Lord doesn't resort to the miraculous when other means are available. And as modes of transportation go, Jesus was certainly not opposed to using his feet. And that's how I think he came out of the tomb, on his feet. Which brings us to the second point of interest in this part of the reading, the stupefaction of the guards. According to Matthew 28:4, when the angel appeared and rolled the stone away, the centurions guarding the tomb became like dead men. But Matthew doesn't tell us in what sense they were like dead men. However, it seems reasonable to propose either that they fainted or that they were petrified with fear. Either way, their state of shock sounds like a temporary condition, one from which you might imagine they would have recovered within a few minutes. However, it appears that they were so stupefied, so disoriented, so dazed and confused at the appearance of this angel that they remained in a state of shock long enough for the rest of this passage to play out without any involvement on their part. For they offered no resistance to those who were coming and going from the tomb over the course of the next hour or so. Indeed, they took no action at all until all the witnesses to the empty tomb had come and gone. And third, I think it's worth noting that Mary Magdalene is the first to make the connection between the Lord's prophecies of his own death, burial, and resurrection and what was taking place that morning in the garden tomb. Because apparently she was paying attention. She was listening when the Lord spoke, and she had taken what he said to heart. Mary had a mind of her own, and she was thinking for herself, and that's what brought her to faith before anyone else. Now, I'll probably do a whole series on this when I get the time, but just a heads up, this is super relevant for today's world. Because the watchword among 21st century atheists is, no, I don't believe because I think for myself. Because they have become persuaded that free thought automatically leads to disbelief. But beloved, that simply isn't so. The proposition that one has to choose between Christianity and thinking for oneself is a false dichotomy. It's manifestly false. Indeed, nothing could be more godlike than free thought. Returning to our text, but Mary kept after Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, saying to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. You see, apparently, Mary Magdalene was also listening when Jesus in Luke 18:2-5 said, there was a judge in a certain town who had neither fear of God nor respect for anyone. In the same town there was also a widow who kept on coming to him and saying, I want justice from you against my enemy. For a long time he refused, but at last he said to himself, even though I have neither fear of God nor respect for any human person, I must give this widow her just rights, since she keeps pestering me. Otherwise she will continue bothering me until at long last she wears me down. And Mary was able to take that parable and generalize it. Because though, according to Jesus, the purpose of the parable was to teach the apostles to persist in prayer, Mary intuited from that parable that persistence pays off in other situations as well. And it paid off here, as we see in the continuing text. So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And I find this interesting, because this report comes to us from the Gospel of John. And throughout his Gospel, John never so much as refers to himself in the first person. He's genuinely humble and seems determined not to make the narrative about himself. Indeed, even though he is the disciple that Jesus loved, even though he was Jesus' best friend on earth, he accepted that it was to be Peter and not himself who was to be the earthly shepherd of the first church. And he never seems to get involved in any of the rivalries that later arise between certain ones of the apostles. But when Mary persuaded Peter and John to come to the tomb of Jesus and to see it for themselves, John outruns Peter and arrives at the tomb before he does, and he just can't help himself but to let everyone know that. Peter may be the first among the apostles, but John could run faster than he could. And he doesn't just tell us about it, but he rubs it in with Peter just a smidge. Because when he arrives at the tomb, he doesn't go in. Rather, just as he probably should, he defers to Peter. But these two are lifelong rivals from two competing fishing businesses in Bethsaida, Zebedee and Sons and Jonah and Sons. And even as serious as this moment in history turns out to be, I can just see John, after he arrives at the tomb, grinning and winking at Peter and saying, after you. Well, back to our text. And stooping to look in, He saw the shroud lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the shroud lying there, and the sudarium, which had been on Jesus' head, lying not with the shroud, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed, even though they did not as yet understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes, Peter marveling at what had happened. So John is the second to believe, and Peter is the third. And they come to faith at just about the same time, which I think is interesting because Peter and John do not think alike. Peter is a simpler man than John. Peter is a concrete thinker. But John is much more philosophical, even more philosophical than Paul, though he's less well educated than Paul is. Peter learned by doing, by trial and error. But John is a highly intuitive learner. I mean, did you ever wonder why John's gospel reads so much differently from the synoptic gospels? Well, there may be more than one reason, but I'm persuaded that one of the reasons is because John listened to Jesus in a way unique to himself and to his relationship with the Lord. Because John was the disciple Jesus loved, and I think that he had a deep level of intuition in terms of understanding what Jesus meant when he said things. In Romans 8:26, Paul tells us, "Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words." And I think that John, on some level, had a real knack for properly discerning and interpreting the groanings of the Spirit of his beloved friend, Jesus. And as such, I think that at least some of the words of Christ reported to us by John were spoken not by Jesus' mouth, but by his heart. Because it was to the heart of Jesus that John was bound. Nevertheless, even though Peter and John think very differently from one another, they both come to saving faith at the same time and on the basis of the same evidence, which evidence does not yet include any direct evidence of the resurrection. That is, up to this point, none of them has seen Jesus yet. What they have seen is an earthquake, an angel, an empty tomb, and a couple of Roman centurions, half catatonic, milling about the entrance of the tomb in an early PTSD state. But as of yet, there's no sign of the Lord. But that's about to change. As we return to our text, John and Peter have left the tomb, satisfied with what they have seen, but Mary stays behind. Meanwhile, Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she and the other women wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. Entering, they did not find the body of the Lord. And while this set them at naught, Mary saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet, and this alarmed them. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She answered, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." The younger of the two, who was sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Then go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Now, I hope that this doesn't sound too disrespectful, because I don't intend for it to be. But on the face of it, this question that the angel asked Mary has always struck me as incredibly dense, as staggeringly obtuse and imperceptive. "Woman, why are you weeping?" Well, are you kidding me? I mean, just 3 days prior to this, on preparation day for the Passover, she was just getting started on her holiday cooking. And on the heels of that meal, she had heard the best sermon of her life. She had witnessed a tremendous display of humility and love by the Lord and the washing of the apostles' feet. And she had been party to one of the most powerful prayers ever prayed, followed by the spontaneous singing of hymns. Then, after having been up for 18 hours already, she found herself witness to the arrest, trial, conviction, and execution of her Lord as an enemy of the state. She was betrayed by Judas and abandoned by Peter, just as everyone else in Jesus' inner circle had been. She watched as the Lord's very lifeblood drained from his body, while his mother and his best friend looked on. Then she watched as he was taken down from the cross, wrapped, embalmed, and buried in a crypt with the door sealed and armed guards set in place. Then, a day later, she had left the house at 3 o'clock in the morning to go and buy spices to anoint the Lord. She's made the trek on foot between the house and the graveyard over a mile away 3 times, the second and third time running at full tilt. In the meantime, she's been through 2 earthquakes, 3 hours of earthquake smog, and has witnessed the sudden appearance of 3 angels. She is exhausted. She's away from home in an unfamiliar environment. She's been betrayed and abandoned by close friends. The rest of her friends don't believe her, and she has repeatedly crossed under the yellow tape that says police line do not cross while the police were watching, but inexplicably unvigilant. And she's just keeping her fingers crossed that they don't suddenly come to their senses while she's around. And to top it all off, she's in the graveyard, one of the creepiest places in the world, in a tomb, and she has just been startled to the core by the sudden appearance of 2 supernatural beings. Mary is having the worst day ever, and this guy wants to know why she's weeping. I mean, every time I read that, I think, are you kidding me? Why is she weeping? Right. There must be something wrong with her. She hasn't thought this through clearly. If she had, then she'd know better than to let her emotions run away with her like this. Why are you weeping? Well, I have to be charitable with this angel. After all, tone of voice, facial expression, and intent count for a lot. And Mary doesn't seem to have been offended by the question. So clearly, she sensed something of the demeanor of this angel that doesn't come through in the written account. And to be fair, Jesus asked the same question not 2 minutes later. So I suppose the angel isn't totally out of line for asking. And God bless Mary, she has an answer for him. I'm weeping because everything is amiss and I don't know what's going on. The angel has an answer that is dead on responsive to her plaintive cry. Nothing is amiss. Everything is just as it should be, and I'm here to tell you what's going on. Which is exactly what he does, as our text continues. Then, all at once, the 2 men were standing beside them, dressed in dazzling apparel. And the women, frightened by this, bowed their faces to the ground. And the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise. Therefore go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, it is as I have told you." And just like that, Mary's day goes from being very bad to being very good. Just like that, the day changes from being the worst day ever to being the best day ever. But wait, there's more, because Mary's day is going to get even better yet as we return to our text. At this, being filled with a combination of fear and great joy, and beset with trembling and astonishment, none of them said another word. But they turned to flee the tomb and to run and tell his disciples. And as she turned around, Mary saw Jesus, who had been standing behind her, but she did not recognize him. And here's where the chronology of events, as I'm presenting them to you today, is really critical. In most reconstructions of the resurrection morning, all of this interaction between Mary, the angels, and Jesus takes place before the women run and tell the disciples what they had seen at all, which trek they only make once. And that usually places the first appearance of Christ, his appearance to Mary, in the garden, outside the tomb, in broad daylight. And that has always left me with an unsettling question, which is why Mary did not recognize Jesus when she saw him. I mean, I know that later that day, when Jesus appeared to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, they were prevented from recognizing him until they broke bread with him. But in their case, they, by their own testimony, do not believe that Jesus has in fact risen from the dead. But that isn't so for Mary. No, she believed even before she knew that the tomb was empty. The truth about Jesus was not hidden from her eyes. So why is it that she didn't recognize him right away as soon as she saw him in the garden? Well, because She didn't see him in the garden. She saw him in the tomb. That's where this conversation is taking place, in the tomb. So think this through logistically. Mary has had very little sleep. She's grief-stricken, and she's been weeping. And then she steps out of the daylight and into the darkness of the tomb. And just as her eyes adjust to the darkness well enough that she can see that the body of Jesus is not in the tomb, she's suddenly blinded by the appearance of two angels dressed in radiant clothing, dressed in light-emitting robes. And she is talking to them with her back to the entrance to the tomb, the only source of natural light in this dark environment. And then as she turns to leave the tomb, she's startled to see a man standing behind her, but she does not recognize him. Well, why not? Well, because she can't see his face. His back is to the light, and his face is in the dark, and it takes a minute for her eyes to adjust. And with that in mind, what happens next makes more sense to me. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary?" Her face lit up, and she said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And they came and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. But Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And here is where what I preached about a few weeks ago in lesson number 359, actual blood, it comes into play. Because it's immediately after this conversation between his appearance to Mary and his appearance on the road to Emmaus later that afternoon that Jesus carried out the transaction recorded in Hebrews 9:11 through 12. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, is not part of this creation. He did not enter bearing aloft the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the Holy of Holies once for all, bearing aloft his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. And if you want to hear more about that, I invite you to go online and listen to this lesson there. Resuming with our text, then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." Now, as it turns out, Jesus doesn't make the apostles wait before he appears to them. He does appear to them later in Galilee, and it's there that he imparts to them the biggest portion of the post-resurrection teaching. And we'll be covering that in another lesson soon. This morning, however, I just have time to finish out the account of this first appearance. Returning to our text, we find that the women leave the garden tomb just in the nick of time, because as soon as they go, the guards awaken from their stupor. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. And then finally, Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and she reported everything that he had said to her. She made the same report to all those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. That, beloved, is the gospel account of what happened on the morning that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's my lesson for today.
This has been a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ. We hope that you have found Dr. Becker's message well appointed. To hear more lessons like this one, visit our website at www.steamboatchurch.org or come see us at 1698 Lincoln Avenue in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Bible classes are Sunday mornings at 9:30 and worship services are at 10:30. We look forward to meeting you. Until then, may the grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you.